In the deep silence of space, there was a vessel drifting toward a research station, and inside that vessel was an alien biologist named Loren, who believed he had already seen everything the universe could show him. He had studied creatures that could live inside burning stars, and he had studied parasites that survived on the skin of giant leviathans, and he had even recorded plants that communicated with light instead of sound. Yet, in all his long career, he felt there was nothing left that could surprise him. Now he had been sent to a station at the edge of human territory, and he told himself that this mission would be dull because humans were said to be weak and short-lived, and nothing about them seemed extraordinary. When the vessel docked, the doors opened with a hiss, and the air inside smelled of sterile metal and recycled oxygen, and Loren stepped out slowly, his long limbs moving with quiet certainty, as if he owned the place. The station was small compared to the grand laboratories he had known, and there were very few staff members, most of them working silently behind glowing panels and glass walls, as if they did not wish to look directly at him. In the center of the main chamber stood a transparent containment cell, and inside sat a human subject, a man named Eli, and he looked very ordinary, with short hair and tired eyes and a frame that seemed too fragile to be of interest. Loren stared at him for a long while and thought that this was going to be a waste of time and effort, because how could this fragile creature reveal anything new? But then Eli raised his head, and for a brief moment their eyes met, and Loren felt something he could not quite describe, because those eyes were not blank and empty like the eyes of other test subjects from other worlds. Instead, they carried a strange weight, as if behind them lived countless stories of pain and hope. Loren ignored the feeling and activated his recording instruments and began the first set of observations, measuring heartbeat, breathing, and brain activity, while Eli sat silently and watched. The readings came back exactly as expected: weak, fragile, unimpressive, and Loren wrote in his notes that the human matched the standard data collected by others, and yet he could not stop himself from looking at Eli again and wondering why the subject did not seem afraid. Most species, when placed inside the containment cell, showed fear and anxiety. They tried to hide, or they begged for release, or they fought against the walls in desperation. But Eli simply sat there, calm and still, as if he already knew what would come and had accepted it. Loren moved closer to the cell and spoke through the translator, asking the human if he understood why he was here, and Eli answered with a voice that was steady and clear, saying that he knew he was being studied and that he would cooperate. That answer unsettled Loren, because he had expected confusion or fear, and instead he heard calm acceptance and even curiosity, as if the human wanted to see what the alien biologist would do next. Loren decided to begin the first small test, exposing Eli to different environmental conditions, lowering the temperature and raising the gravity levels slightly, enough to make most species struggle, but not enough to kill them. As the gravity increased, Eli clenched his fists and his muscles strained, yet he remained upright and did not collapse even when sweat rolled down his forehead and his breath grew heavy. And this surprised Loren, because according to his calculations, the subject should have already fallen. He adjusted the controls and increased the pressure further until Eli was trembling, yet still standing, his teeth pressed together, his body shaking with effort, and his eyes burning with something Loren could not name. Finally, Loren ended the test and released the pressure, and Eli fell to his knees, gasping for air. Yet he did not cry out, and he did not beg. Instead, he looked up at Loren with a faint smile, as if to say that he had endured, and he was proud of it. The biologist recorded the results and frowned, because this was not the outcome he had expected, and he felt a small spark of interest grow inside him. Later, as he studied the brain scan results, he noticed a flicker of activity during the moment. Eli had nearly collapsed. The readings spiked in ways that made no logical sense, as if his mind had called on something unseen, something unmeasurable. Loren stared at the screen, and for the first time in many years he felt curiosity. returning stronger than ever because he realized that maybe humans were not as ordinary as everyone believed. Returned to the containment chamber and looked again at Eli, who now sat quietly, his chest still rising and falling from exhaustion, and yet his eyes held that same strange fire. And in that moment, Laurent thought to himself that perhaps this human was going to change everything he believed about life and about science. And about the universe itself. Laurent walked back into the observation room, and his hands moved over the glowing controls as he prepared the next set of experiments. And in his mind, there was a storm because he kept thinking about what he had just seen inside. The human subject named Eli. He reminded himself that science must stay clean and cold, and he repeated that humans were weak and limited and fragile. Yet he could not ignore the image of Eli standing against crushing gravity and refusing to fall until the very last moment. The next test would push endurance further, and he told himself this was only to confirm expected limits and to prove that the earlier result was nothing more than chance. The walls of the chamber shifted and bright artificial light poured down on Eli as the temperature began to rise. Slowly, first like a warm day, then like a desert noon, and then like the inside of a furnace. And Laurent watched carefully as the human reacted. At first, Eli squinted against the light and wiped sweat from his brow, and then he pressed his palms to the floor, breathing heavy. But he did not collapse, he did not cry for help. Instead, he closed his eyes and whispered something that the translator could not fully capture. But the words sounded like family and home and promise. Laurent frowned, because such words in the middle of extreme heat made no logical sense. Yet somehow, the human seemed to draw strength from speaking them, and the instruments showed his heart struggling, but not breaking, and his body refusing to give up. The biologist increased the heat further, waiting for the subject to fall, and waiting for the moment his fragile system would surrender. But Eli only clenched his jaw and forced himself to remain conscious, his lips moving with faint words about hope and about never letting go. The numbers on the screen confused Laurent because no other being he had studied endured this kind of strain without permanent damage. Yet Eli's body adapted, shifting faster than predicted, as if some hidden process inside him had been unlocked by pure will. Finally, Laurent stopped the test and cooled the chamber, and Eli collapsed to the floor. But when the door opened and medical drones rushed in, he raised his hand weakly to stop them and said he was fine and that he had to continue because he wanted to prove himself. Those words echoed inside Laurent's mind because he had heard creatures beg for mercy and he had seen them collapse and surrender, but never had he seen one rise after such torture and say that he wished to continue that night. Laurent studied the scans alone in his chamber, and he saw the same strange spikes in the brain activity, the same bursts of impossible energy that science had no name for, and he replayed the recordings again and again, trying to understand how emotion could rewrite biology. His colleagues on the station dismissed the data. They said the human was an accident or a fluke, or perhaps the instruments were faulty. They laughed at the idea that such a short-lived species could hold secrets that greater civilizations had not discovered. But Laurent did not laugh, and he did not stop thinking, because in his heart, a small voice whispered that something new was standing in front of him, something his people had overlooked for ages, because they were too blind with pride. The next day he returned to Eli and began the endurance cycle, this time with alternating extremes: freezing cold, then blistering heat, then crushing pressure, and finally starvation levels of oxygen. And through each stage, Eli staggered and fell, and then rose again with trembling arms and burning eyes. At one point, when oxygen dropped too low, Eli fell to his knees and whispered, with tears in his eyes, about his family, about faces he would never see again if he failed. And somehow those words pushed him to rise and take another step forward, even when his body should have already shut down. Laurent gripped the edge of the console and whispered to himself that this should be impossible because no creature can walk without air. And yet the human moved forward one slow step at a time. When The cycle ended. Eli collapsed, and this time he remained on the floor unconscious, and the med drones rushed in and revived him with quick injections and steady pulses of energy. And when his eyes opened, the first thing he said was, "Did I do it, and did I endure?" Lauren looked at him with something close to awe because he realized the human was not fighting for himself alone. He was fighting for something larger and invisible, something his science had never measured. Before that night, Lauren stood before the viewing glass and stared at the stars outside, and for the first time in countless years he felt doubt about his own beliefs. Because if one human could rise again and again, against all odds, then what would an entire species be capable of? He turned back to the console and replayed Eli's words about hope and family and promise, and he wrote in his notes that humans do not simply endure. They fight for ideas that live beyond the body and beyond reason. And in that moment he felt something stir inside his chest, a feeling he had not known in a long time, a mixture of fear and wonder, because he realized he was no longer only studying a subject, he was standing at the edge of a revelation that could change everything. The station was silent in the long hours of artificial night, and only the hum of machines filled the air while Lauren sat alone with the endless lines of data, and he stared at the glowing screens that showed the impossible patterns. Again and again, his colleagues had dismissed his findings with laughter. They told him the human was weak and nothing more than a curiosity. They said no report should waste time on one fragile creature, and they called it an error in measurement, or perhaps a glitch in the instruments. But Lauren knew what he had seen with his own eyes. He had seen Eli rise when no one else should have risen, and he had seen his body refuse to surrender when science demanded collapse, and he had heard words about family and hope that carried a strength machines could not record, yet somehow they changed the results before him. Biologist tried to remind himself of his training. He told himself that emotion is noise and data is truth, but each time he repeated the words, he felt them break apart inside, because the human had shown him that something beyond numbers was shaping the outcome. Next morning he returned to the chamber and found Eli awake and sitting quietly, his body bruised and scarred from the trials, yet his eyes calm, as if the suffering had not broken him. Instead it had sharpened him into something stronger. Lauren asked him why he kept fighting when it would be easier to give up, and Eli smiled faintly and answered that humans never stop, because even when they fall they rise again, for those they love and for the hope of tomorrow. Those words echoed in the chamber like a song, and Lauren felt a strange heaviness in his chest because no other subject had ever spoken such things. In the middle of pain, most only cursed their fate or begged for mercy. But Eli spoke of love and tomorrow. The biologist increased the difficulty of the tests, not because he wished to harm, but because he needed to know if the human spirit could truly endure beyond flesh and blood. So he created simulations of drowning in endless water and burning in fire and walking through storms of radiation. Each time Eli suffered and fell and screamed, yet each time he rose again, and his voice carried words of defiance and belief. He spoke of ancestors who survived hunger and war and disease. He spoke of children who would carry dreams forward, even if he failed, and he spoke of humanity never yielding to despair. The instruments recorded strange surges during each moment. His spirit burned brightest, the graphs spiking like jagged mountains, reaching heights no alien mind could comprehend. And Lauren knew this was no malfunction, because it repeated every single time at night. Lauren wrote in his secret log that the human spirit was more than biology and more than survival. It was a force unknown, a power born from struggle and sacrifice. And it frightened him because it suggested that his entire science might be incomplete. Days passed and Eli continued to endure, but his body grew weaker, his frame thin, and his skin pale. Yet his eyes burned with fire, and Lauren found himself unable to look away from that fire because it reminded him of something long lost in his own people. One evening, while Eli rested between trials, He spoke to Loran without being asked. He said that his people had always walked through darkness, but in the fight in the Von, and they always found light, because they carried light inside them, even when the universe was. Cruel Loran asked what that light was, and Eli simply placed a hand on his chest and said it was hope. It was love. It was the memory of those who came before, and the dream of those who will come after, and that no machine could ever measure it. The alien biologist felt a tremor inside, because for the first time he considered that perhaps humans had tapped into something larger than matter and energy, something invisible yet real, and he wondered if that was why they had survived so many trials. On their homeworld, despite all odds, the next day, Loran presented his findings to the Council of Scientists on the station, but they only dismissed him again. They said he had grown too close to his subject. They said emotion had poisoned his logic. And they warned him not to waste resources on myths. But Loran could not silence what he had seen. He returned to the chamber and watched Eli endure yet another impossible trial. And when the human fell and rose again, with trembling arms, and whispered words of defiance, the biologist felt tears on his own face, something he had not known in centuries. He realized then that he was no longer just a scientist. He was a witness to something extraordinary, something his people had denied for too long. The machines confirmed it again and again. When Eli's heart should have failed, it did not. When his mind should have collapsed, it sharpened. When his body should have surrendered, it pushed beyond all measure, and the spikes of energy in his brain flared like storms of living fire. That night Loran stared into the mirror of his chamber and whispered that maybe the universe had hidden its greatest secret inside this fragile species that everyone thought unworthy and weak. And as he whispered those words, he knew that his belief was cracking like glass breaking under pressure, because science alone could not explain the miracle he was watching unfold. Chamber was silent when the final stage of testing began, and the only sound was the deep hum of machines waking from their sleep as power surged through the walls, and the floor trembled like the heartbeat of a giant waiting to rise. Loran stood at the controls, his hands heavy and his chest tight, because he knew this test would push Eli further than ever before, and he wondered if he was about to watch the human break completely, or if he was about to see something the galaxy had never known before. He told himself this was necessary because the data demanded proof, and his mind demanded answers. Yet in the quiet corners of his heart he felt guilt, because he knew he was no longer just testing an experiment. He was pushing a living being beyond the limits of mercy. The lights inside the chamber flared bright white, and the gravity multiplied tenfold, crushing down like an invisible mountain. Eli staggered, his legs buckled, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he forced himself to remain on his feet, his eyes burning like coals in the storm. The pressure increased again, and the machines began to hiss with strain, as if even the technology itself doubted the path chosen, and Eli fell to his knees, his body trembling, his hands pressed against the floor, yet he refused to bow his head. He lifted it with effort and whispered words so faint the translator barely caught them. He said, "We fight for each other, not only for ourselves." Loran felt those words strike him like a blade, because no other subject in all his long career had ever spoken of others while drowning in pain. They had always fought for survival alone, but Eli carried the weight of unseen souls inside his chest, and he endured for them. Biologist increased the test further against his own fear. The air inside the chamber grew thin. Temperature swung between fire and ice, and waves of simulated radiation rolled through the walls, and yet through all of this the human crawled forward inch by inch, refusing to surrender. The monitors screamed with numbers that made no sense. Heart rate beyond safe measure, brain activity spiking in violent waves, muscles tearing and healing in impossible cycles. And Loran realized with terror and awe that Eli was becoming more than data. He was becoming proof of something no science could deny. At one moment, Eli collapsed flat on the ground, and the machines declared failure. But then, against every law of biology, his body twitched, his arms pushed against the floor, and he rose again, blood streaking from his lips and his voice cracking. With words that echoed across the chamber, he said, "We never stop because tomorrow waits for us." Loran gripped the console, his hands shaking, because he felt as if the ground beneath him was falling away, his entire foundation of belief shattering like fragile glass, because he knew he was witnessing something his people had never dared to imagine. The instruments reached critical levels, energy readings soaring beyond the scale designed for the test, and alarms rang through the station. Drones moved to shut down the sequence, but Loran stopped them with a single command, because his eyes were fixed on Eli, and he whispered that this moment must be recorded. Pressure climbed. The light inside the chamber burned like a sun, and the human stood once more, his body broken yet unyielding, and for a brief heartbeat the scanners detected a burst of unknown energy exploding from his mind, a wave so powerful it distorted the machines and bent the matter inside the room. Loran staggered back as sparks rained from the consoles, and the walls shook as if struck by a force greater than gravity, and in the middle of it, Eli stood with arms spread wide like a figure defying the universe itself. Then suddenly the energy burst ended, and the human collapsed silent and still, his body limp against the cold floor, and the chamber filled with smoke, and the alarms screamed until the systems finally shut down in emergency mode. Medical drones rushed inside, lifting Eli's motionless form and carrying him out of the chamber, and Loran followed, his eyes wide and his heart heavy, because he did not know if the subject was alive or dead, only that something impossible had just happened before them all. The council of scientists gathered, demanding answers, their voices sharp with fear and anger. But Loran ignored them. He pushed past and followed the drones into the recovery bay, where Eli lay on a table, pale and broken yet somehow still breathing, though faint and fragile. Loran leaned close and listened to the weak heartbeat, and saw the faint rise and fall of his chest, and he whispered that the human had endured the impossible, and that no one could deny it now, not even the proudest voice of the council. In his private log that night, Loran wrote that the human spirit was not only survival, but a force capable of bending reality itself, a force born from hope and sacrifice and love, and he confessed that he feared what might come if the rest of the galaxy learned the truth, because if one human could unleash such energy at the edge of death, then what might many humans do together if they carried that same fire inside them? The biologist stared out the viewport at the stars, scattered like ancient fires across the void, and he whispered that the universe was about to change forever because of a fragile creature who refused to surrender even when crushed beneath the weight of all the cosmos. The recovery bay was silent, except for the soft rhythm of machines breathing for Eli, and the faint pulse of his heart echoing in the still air. And Loran stood beside the table, staring at the fragile human body that had endured storms no creature should have survived. His hands trembled, because in his mind he replayed the vision of the energy burst that had filled the chamber, the moment when matter itself had bent under the force of something unseen. And he knew that he had witnessed more than survival. He had witnessed a truth greater than any calculation. The council arrived, their voices cold and sharp. They demanded that the subject be terminated at once. They called Eli dangerous, unstable, unpredictable, and they ordered Loran to erase the records and bury the results. But the biologist could not obey, because in his heart he felt that doing so would erase the greatest discovery of his life. He stood firm against them, his voice shaking but strong, as he declared that humans were not weak, not ordinary, not disposable. He said that within them burned a force science could not explain, a force born from hope and sacrifice and love, and that to destroy this was to destroy the future itself. The council called him a fool. They threatened to remove him from the station and strip him of his work. But Loran did not back down. He told them that he had seen the truth with his own eyes, and that even if they silenced him, the universe would one day learn what humanity truly was. When the council left in anger, Loran returned to Eli's side, and for long hours he remained there, watching it and waiting until at last the human stirred, his eyes opening, slowly filled with pain, yet also with that same fire that had carried him through every trial. Leela's voice was weak but steady as he whispered, "Did I endure?" And Lauren felt his chest tighten because he realized that the human cared not about himself, but about proving that hope could survive even in the darkest test. And he answered, "Yes, you endured, and you showed me something greater than science." The human closed his eyes again, but a faint smile touched his lips, and in that moment, Lauren understood that the true strength of humanity was not in their bodies, but in the spirit that refused to surrender. No matter how heavy the weight of the universe became, days passed, and Eli recovered slowly, though scars marked his skin, and his strength returned only little by little. Yet each time he looked at Lauren, his eyes still carried that unbroken flame. And it filled the biologist with both awe and fear. Lauren began to write his final report, a document that would travel beyond the station and reach the higher councils of knowledge across the galaxy. And in it he wrote that humans must never again be judged as fragile or ordinary. He wrote that they were something new, a force evolution itself could not predict. He described how in the moment of greatest pain the human spirit created energy beyond measurement, how emotion became strength, and how hope became a power greater than flesh. He explained that this was not anomaly, but essence, that humans carried it within them like an unquenchable fire. When the report was finished, he signed it with trembling hands, because he knew it would change everything and perhaps place him in danger. But he could not remain silent, because silence would be betrayal of the truth. Council tried to stop him. They said the galaxy was not ready for such knowledge. They feared what might happen if other civilizations learned that humanity could rise against any chain. But Lauren sent the report anyway through hidden channels, ensuring that it would reach far beyond their grasp. Soon whispers spread across distant worlds, whispers of a fragile creature that had defied impossible odds, whispers of a spirit that could not be broken, and whispers of a force that even machines could not measure. And though many doubted, some began to fear, and some began to wonder. But none could deny that the data was real, and that the story of the human called Eli had planted a seed that could never be erased. Lauren returned to the chamber, one final time standing in the place where the human had risen against the storm, and he pressed his hand against the glass wall, feeling the cold surface beneath his skin, and he whispered to the empty air that he had once believed nothing could surprise him. Yet a single human had changed his entire life. Behind him, Eli's voice called out, weak but steady, asking what comes next. And Lauren turned to him, and for the first time in many years he smiled, and he said, "What comes next is a universe that must learn to see you as you truly are, not as weak, not as ordinary, but as a force of hope that will shape what is to come." The human nodded slowly, and though his body still carried pain, his eyes carried endless strength, and Lauren knew that this was the revelation he had been waiting for. Not the numbers on a screen, not the graphs or the scans, but the truth that burned in the heart of a single fragile being who had shown that spirit is stronger than science, and that hope can bend the stars themselves. And with that truth, Lauren understood that the galaxy would never again look at humans the same way, because they had been revealed not as subjects, not as experiments, but as a force that could endure the impossible and rise even from the edge of death. In the silence of the station, with the stars watching from beyond the glass, Lauren whispered his final words into his recorder, and they were simple, yet they carried the weight of eternity. He said, "Humans are not weak, they are not ordinary. They are the fire that even the void cannot extinguish. The end